So that is like the majority of the gear that I kind of carry with me camera-wise. Everybody's kits will probably be a little bit, plus or minus depending on kind of what your budgets are or what you have access to. The idea isn't really what you carry, it's more how you know how you can work with it and how fast you can work with it kind of thing. Because a lot of these things, I mean, I worked on things where it's like, we had to interview when she was the governor, when we had to interview Governor Napolitano, and she was going to coach one of the women's games, and she literally had 2 minutes, but we didn't know when her 2 minutes were. So we kind of followed her around until she eventually just stopped, and literally it was like, she stopped and turned and just was like, hey, how's it going? And then it was like, you have to be like, oh, and you have to be going because she literally has 2 minutes to go. And then, so you kind of have to have knowledge of what, where everything is, what's kind of set up, and also how to adjust it in case something goes wrong, like what your backups are. Like one of the greatest things that I ever kind of learned was when I was working at Firehouse Pictures, which is a production company in town. One of the producers there always said belts and suspenders. Like she loved to wear belts and suspenders, meaning like always have like a backup plan because this stuff will break, or it will batteries will die, or something will go crazy, and it'll usually happen at the worst possible moment, kind of thing. So that's the majority of my camera gear. And then for lights, I'll kind of just set this over here. Does anybody have any questions so far about anything? The usual setup that I do is, when I'm kind of doing most of the videos that I do, is they're usually +1s. It's usually just, which is an OKBT term, but it basically means that I'm just doing one-on-one interviews. Since I only have one mic, I usually don't like to put 2 people in a shot because somebody's always going to get neglected on the audio. Like somebody will always be kind of quiet. So what I usually do is I'll set it up so that I do one-on-one interviews. It's usually better to do your interviews before you go shoot extra footage or get B-roll, because then you kind of know better what to look for. You can do it the other way and you'll still be able to probably put everything together pretty well. But in my experience, it's like if you do an interview with somebody and and they're talking about specific items or specific things, they'll usually start to linger on things that they find more important. And then when you're shooting footage, you can kind of focus on those things. So that's usually how I'll kind of set it up. So what I'll kind of do is I usually go into a space, like if I was going to walk into a space, the 2 things I look for first are what the lighting situation is, or the 3 things, I guess. Look at what my light is like in the room. I'll look at what my audio is like in the room, and then I'll also look for plugs, where my outlets are in the room. Those are like the 3 most important things to kind of look for. Shooting, one of the worst rooms to shoot at on campus is actually the Union Gallery, because there's actually 3 different sources of light. I think they've actually changed it so maybe there's only 2 sources of light now. But it used to be they had the overhead fluorescence, they had all these windows open that you couldn't really control, where you had daylight coming in, and they also had tungsten lights. And basically, light burns at different color temperatures. And a lot of times you don't really notice it until you shoot something and then you bring it back and you'll be like, oh, everything looks really green. And for the most part, when you're doing stuff and you're editing it, you can kind of correct for that. You can do a lot of color correction, you can work all that stuff out. When you have 2 different sources of light in a shot, then it becomes trickier. Because if you're shooting someone in tungsten and that burns at 3200 kelvins, that's usually more like an orange light. And you have daylight, which is 5600, which is a bluer light. If the person's face is colored correctly, the background will look blue. It'll look like there's a blue light coming in behind them, or vice versa. Like the background will be normal, and then everything else will be orange. So keeping an eye out for what you can control and how you can kind of shoot is usually you have to figure that out pretty quickly. Like for instance, this room, you can't control this window at all because there's no blinds on it on this side. So you can control it pretty well, actually. So you might be able to block off all the daylight stuff for it, and then turn off the interior lights, and then just kind of set up, your interview with just your tungsten lights. if you're really rushed for time, you might not be able to set up any lights. You might just be like the all-panel thing we shot at DeKalb, and it was just like we just had to go with whatever light they had available and just expose as best as you could.